These are 3 separate desks, 3 separate tops, 3 separate pours, and 3 live edges that have absolutely no reason to match each other. The problem is when they're installed, they're supposed to look like one desk. One very long desk. This is where people almost always say they don't want to do tables anymore. This client needed 3 workstations in the same room, one for him and one for each of his kids. And instead of just making 3 normal desks, I decided the grain, the epoxy at the back, and even the live edges at the front should continue from one desk into the next. Which is a nice idea. Right up until you remember, I have to build all 3 of them separately. The walnut was already cut down into 3 rough tops when I started filming, mostly because watching someone move large slabs around and make straight cuts is only exciting for 5 seconds. Not that watching someone plane wood is, but we do have to start somewhere, don't we? At least the planer gave me a few minutes to think about the one thing I really couldn't afford to screw up. The important part was keeping track of the order. Left, middle, and right. Because from this point on, every decision I made on one desk had to continue into the next one. And apparently, writing 3 letters on a piece of tape would have been far too easy. So naturally, I just kept checking them about 17 times. Eventually, they were flat, straight, and somehow still in the right order. So I could finally start cutting them down and figure out how to make 3 separate epoxy pours look like one continuous desk. The next thing I needed to do was bring all 3 pieces a little closer to their final length. Not final length, just closer, because I have a very healthy relationship with commitment, as you all know. These desks are just over 1.3 meters long, and once you start removing material from a slab this size, putting it back becomes surprisingly difficult. So I let myself a little extra at both ends and made the first cuts. Then the second. And because apparently this video has a theme, the third. The front of every desk was going to stay as a live edge, and I actually wanted to keep quite a lot of the original shape. The problem with keeping the live edge is that trees tend to come with tree attached to them, so all the bark had to go. I normally quite like this job. There's something incredibly satisfying about getting under a piece of bark and having the whole thing come off at once. That's what you want. Then there's this. This is the part that has apparently signed a long-term lease. And underneath the bark, there's usually another layer of loose material that also has to come off. I wasn't trying to sculpt the fronts yet. At this point, I was really just cleaning them enough to see what shape I actually had, because later all 3 of these edges would have to meet, And this is where the whole idea for these 3 desks becomes slightly annoying. Individually, none of these edges really matter. They're live edges. One moves in, one moves out. That's kind of the point. But these desks weren't going to be seen individually. They were going to be side by side. So the end of this one had to make some kind of visual sense with the beginning of the other one. And the same thing had to happen again on the third one. I couldn't make them match yet. There's still epoxy to pour, flattening to do, and quite a lot of material left to remove. But I need to know I had enough wood in the right places to make it work later. The slight inconvenience was that I had 3 separate pieces of wood, and I needed them to remain 3 separate pieces of wood. So pouring one giant slab and cutting it apart afterwards wasn't really an option. Instead, I had to make 3 separate molds and make the epoxy line continue from one mold to the next. The mold itself is a little strange. Normally, I'd just build walls around the entire slab, but I needed the front live edge completely exposed. So these only have walls at the back and at the 2 ends, which makes this technically an open-ended epoxy mold, or less technically, half a box. By the way, I had a sheet of melamine right there, but as usual, it's the last one, so I'm not going there. The actual width of the epoxy wasn't particularly complicated. What mattered was that every transition landed in the same place, because once the desks are installed, this line has to ride straight through all 3 of them. A small mistake here wouldn't look like 3 slightly different desks. It would look like I can't use a tape measure, which I would prefer not to document in 4K. By the time the third mold was finished, I had measured everything enough times that I no longer trusted any of the measurements, which is usually how I know I'm done. 3 tops, 3 molds, and hopefully one straight line across the back. Now, I just had to fill all this with black epoxy. But before that could happen, the tops had to go into their molds. And because each pour needed to continue into the next one, I spent a little more time making sure everything was sitting exactly what I had planned. Once they were in place, I could start sealing the open front edge. And when I say sealing, I mean using a completely reasonable amount of silicone. The front of these molds is open because I need to keep the live edge, which is great for the design and slightly less great when you're about to pour several liters of very expensive liquid next to it. So every gap, every crack, and basically anything that looked even remotely suspicious got caulked. I've had epoxy find holes I couldn't see before, and it usually waits until you've poured everything, cleaned your tools, and walked away. Then it makes its move. So I wasn't taking any chances here. This is gonna be interesting. Never done this before. Hopefully it works. If not, there's gonna be a lot, and I mean a lot, of epoxy on the floor. With the tops finally in place and the molds hopefully watertight, I sealed the exposed wood with a thin coat of clear epoxy. This isn't really about the color. The black pour is going to cover all of this anyway. The clear coat seals the wood first, so it doesn't spend the next few hours drinking epoxy and releasing air back into the pour, which is how you end up staring at the bubbles that weren't there 5 minutes ago. I made sure to work into the cracks and especially around the live sections that would meet the black epoxy. And then I left everything alone long enough for the clear coat to become tacky. Not cured, just sticky enough that the next layer could bond to it. Then it was finally time for the black epoxy. Because I had 3 separate molds, I also had 3 separate pours. And this was probably the one part where the whole continuous desk idea could go wrong without looking obviously wrong until much later. The color needed to match. The pour height needed to match. And the black section had to stay on the same line across all 3 tops. Let's see how big of a mess we can do. The first desk was easy, mostly because at that point there was nothing to compare to it. The second one was where I could finally see whether all of those measurements actually transferred properly. And then the third one just had to agree with the other 2. Which, thankfully, it looked like it did. 3 separate pours, 3 separate desks, and if everything went according to plan, 1 continuous black line across the back. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to cure, which is usually the easiest part of any epoxy build. Usually. Demolding is normally one of the better parts of an epoxy build. You remove a few screws, pull the sides away, and get to pretend the last few days of worrying about leaks never happened. The first one came out exactly like it was supposed to. So did the second. And then there was the third one. This one had apparently decided that the mold was now a permanent part of the desk. I tried wedges, a little persuasion, then slightly less polite persuasion, and eventually reached the point where I had to admit this wasn't demolding anymore. I was removing the mold one small piece at a time. I still don't know exactly what happened here. Maybe I missed a section with the release agent, maybe the mold surface was damaged, or maybe this desk simply wanted more screen time. Either way, I eventually got most of it off. Most. The rest was now firmly attached to the epoxy, which gave me the perfect opportunity to use the flattening jig for something it was never really meant to do. Instead of flattening the whole top, I took very shallow passes over the epoxy and slowly removed what was left of the mold. This worked. It was also loud, messy, and generated roughly enough plastic dust to open a small recycling center. But eventually I was back to epoxy, and more importantly, I still had 3 desks. With the mold finally removed, all 3 tops needed to be brought flat and to the same thickness. And this is where owning a drum sander becomes less of a luxury and more of a way to preserve what's left of my patience. I started aggressively, very aggressively. The nice thing about the drum sander is that it keeps everything consistent. The less nice thing is that you still have to feed 3 enormous walnut tops through it over and over and over again. But slowly the router marks disappeared. The epoxy became flat, and all 3 tops finally reached the same thickness. At this point, they were still oversized, which was intentional, or at least I'm calling it intentional now. Now that everything was flat, I could finally cut the desk to their exact length and width. This was also the last chance to make sure the epoxy line at the back stayed exactly where I wanted it. So I lined everything up. Again. Left, middle, right. Yep. Still checking. And then I made the final cuts. Once these were done, there wasn't really any extra material left to hide behind, which is always a comforting moment. The back was now sorted. 3 desks, 1 straight epoxy line. The front was still a different story, because these live edges came from different parts of the slab. The transitions between the desks didn't naturally line up, and I knew they wouldn't. There was always going to be the part I had to shape by hand. I pushed all 3 tops together in their final order and started looking at the joints. The idea wasn't to make the entire front edge smooth and symmetrical. I still wanted it to look natural. I just didn't want the curve from one desk to arrive somewhere it didn't supposed to arrive. With the front edges finally flowing into each other, the shape was pretty much done. The only thing left was the 2 outside ends. I added a chamfer to both of them, mostly to take some of the visual weight out of the thick walnut and give the whole thing a clear finish. After that, there wasn't really much left to do, other than sanding them properly. Most people, when it comes to tables, think it's easy. It's just a slab, even with epoxy, which you pour, which is easy, until you get to this part. Sanding 3 tables like this takes you days. This is where people almost always say they don't want to do tables anymore. It's not hard, it's just extremely time consuming. I worked through the grits on the walnut and took the epoxy quite a bit higher until the black started to lose that dull, scratched look. And once everything was clean, I could finally see whether 3 desks and several days of very questionable planning had actually worked. There are few parts of woodworking that work this reliably on camera. Raw walnut spends days looking grey, dusty and slightly disappointing. Then you put finish on it, and suddenly it remembers why walnut is expensive. I used Rubio on all 3 tops. Same finish, same sheen. And for the first time, the grain and the black epoxy finally looked like one design instead of 3 projects occupying every flat surface on my shop. The epoxy lined up at the back, the live edge flowed across the front, and the little chamfers gave each desk its own edge without completely breaking the illusion, which meant there was only one left to properly check it. Individually, they're just 3 desks, and now you can move any of them without touching the other 2. But put them back in the right order, and this is what I was trying to make. One continuous walnut desk, just conveniently divided between 3 people. One for my client and one for each of his kids. The epoxy continues across the back, the live edge continues across the front, and somehow all three of them actually ended up where they were supposed to. Which is nice, because I really didn't want to make a fourth one.